But if you're a teacher and you want to take this work up in your classrooms, you have to acknowledge that you are an actor in a struggle for power. And that's going to be difficult work, and it's going to make some people unhappy.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the McColl Dissertation Fellowship presentation, an annual presentation hosted by the Center for the Study of the American South. Today, we're discussing racism, white supremacy, and the instruction or lack of instruction and conversation about these topics in public schools. Why is meaningful instruction on these topics largely omitted from U.S. history and social studies classes? What challenges do educators face? How might the current model be changed? And what is the role of academia in facilitating more authentic and inclusive instruction about our nation's history? Our McColl Dissertation Fellow will discuss those challenges. My name is Malidna Maynor Lowery. I'm a professor of history and the director of the Center for the Study of the American South at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Each year, through the generous support of Hugh L. McColl Jr., the Center awards a one-year fellowship to support the completion of a dissertation project on a subject related to the history, culture, or society of the American South. So let me introduce our guests. Christoph Stutts is our 2019-2020 McColl Dissertation Fellow. He recently graduated with his Ph.D. in teacher education and curriculum from UNC Chapel Hill's School of Education. Christoph has spent the last 17 years as a public school educator in the roles of special education assistant, high school social studies teacher, and teacher educator. His dissertation, The Place of White Supremacy and Racism in High School U.S. History Classrooms, investigates how high school U.S. history teachers navigate their schools, their communities, and their lives to make decisions about curriculum and instruction around the country's white supremacist and racist legacies. Then historian Rachel Seidman is director of the Southern Oral History Program at the Center for the Study of the American South. Rachel specializes in women's history and holds a Ph.D. from Yale. Her newest book is Speaking of Feminism, Today's Activists on the Past, Present, and Future of the U.S. Women's Movement, published by UNC Press in 2019. She's also author of The Civil War, A History in Documents by Oxford University Press. Rachel and the Southern Oral History Program partner with Carolina K-12 to deliver seminars, lesson plans, archived audio clips, and other teaching materials for public school teachers. The oral histories and educational tools assist with instruction on difficult histories, including slavery, disenfranchisement, and the civil rights movement. So thank you for joining us, Christoph and Rachel. So we want to start by congratulating you, Christoph. You've just graduated, you've defended your dissertation. Dr. Stutts, welcome to the formal academic profession. Well done. This is certainly the type of hard work that needs to be done regarding issues that continue to plague the South and the nation. So tell us about your research a little bit and what drew you to this challenging topic.
I used a comparative case study approach to look at the approach of 3 teachers in one school district who taught U.S. history at the high school level. And their approaches to white supremacy and racism and how they embed that story within the course of study within their classes. I come to this work as a former U.S. history teacher. I also worked in middle schools before that. When I left the classroom 5 years ago now, so I was 10 years, I was a high school social studies teacher. I left the classroom with a persistent gnawing discomfort about the place of U.S. history education in U.S. public high schools. And it was a discomfort that I had sat with for a long time. But as I grew in the profession as a teacher, I found that I was able to have more freedom to make choices about what was included and what was excluded in U.S. history curriculum, but there was still something that was restricting and constraining student encounters with basic realities about white supremacy and racism in this country. And the basic premise that the United States, at its core, is attached to a long, centuries-long racial project, and white supremacy and racism are core of that story, but they're consistently evaded in curriculum. For various reasons, US history teachers, even when they have some level of commitment to teaching about white supremacy and racism in their courses, those critiques of curriculum don't make their way into the school. There's all these systems, these routines, and these valued systems of knowledge that prevent those critiques of curriculum from making their way into the schools. And they also block access to lots of available historical knowledge. So my research is really to try to dig into the messy space of a high school public classroom, a public high school classroom, to see, number one, what is the nature of these teachers' commitment? Why is it that they want to teach about this? How do they teach about it? And then what gets in the way? And the goal from that research is then to figure out how it is social studies and US history education moves past a lament of the state of white-centered, evasive US history education into how to navigate all of the institutional hurdles and barriers that restrict student encounters with the truth of white supremacy and racism.
Thank you. I wonder, Rachel, what some of your responses are to working with K-12 teachers around some of these difficult topics that Southern Oral History Program has provided resources around. Are you seeing similar phenomenon, or would you have a question for Christoph that he might have learned about in his research?
Well, Christoph's, first of all, it's really powerful work that you're doing, and I'm so glad that this work is going to be out there. And it reminded me of a story from actually not my time at the Southern Oral History Program, but from a long time ago when I was teaching a summer class for high school teachers. They were AP history teachers. And it was a class about how to use primary documents to get at a different kind of history than would come through the textbooks. And my point in these, I was working every day with these teachers, and I was trying to sort of say, you can really use these primary documents to get at these questions of race and class and gender that are harder to sometimes get at through the textbook. And I always remember this young guy raised his hand, and he literally said, well, if I spend all this time on race, class, and gender, when am I going to get to the really important stuff?
Right.
And that was just so disheartening to me to hear. And I don't even remember how I replied, because my head was kind of exploding about, how he was defining what's important. Like you say, they've also imbibed this language about what is important, whether that's what's on the test or, what are the big stories in American history that kids need to know, that shape the way they think, even if it's not the way they want to think. Well,
and that's such a great anecdote, because that's exactly the kind of thing that I had a sense of working in schools. I've experienced myself, but I didn't necessarily have language for. And then to understand that there are people writing about that references to what's called master narrative. Master narrative is essentially an understanding of history that proceeds along a frame, probably like what that teacher was talking about, the important stuff.
Right.
So that history that includes race, class, gender, or centers it is pushed to the sideline. Official knowledge, common sense, taken for granted, all of these things are discussed in the literature. But what's interesting is getting in to talk to these teachers. So I had these 3 teachers, and each of them had this expressed commitment to teaching about white supremacy and racism. They were all at different levels of experience. So I had a teacher who was in her 14th year, a teacher was in his 4th year, and a teacher who was in her 1st year. And for each of them, we did get to this point where I was trying to get them to articulate what it was they felt responsible to in terms of the curriculum. Because all of them expressed at minimum apathy, and in some cases outright rejection of the triumphalist story of the United States, right? This patriotic, ever progressing nation in which we reached some final point and we figured out everything, and equality, liberty, justice, freedom, all that stuff. And we've lived out these founding documents, which is the way that the textbooks frame it and the standards and all that stuff. And they rejected that. And they had lessons that rejected that. But even they came back to some felt responsibility to some kind of main course of US history that they were able to only loosely articulate, and they had different terms for. One teacher referred to it as the bare bones. And so the mechanics of how those frames of history and who gets included and who gets excluded is really complicated. We tend to house those things in textbooks and standards alone because those are static documents that we can look at and say, I can look at this table of contents and see how it excludes. I can see the racist aspects of this curriculum. What's harder to pinpoint is how just a general way of approaching US history and that bare bones or that common sense gets passed down from one teacher to the next, or from one class to the next. To the late 1800s, turn of the century, and the textbook frames that entire era as, it's always the Gilded Age. And it tells this story essentially of social uplift in the early 1900s, which erases the experiences of so many at that time. So just take right on its face the experience of violent white supremacy in the South, which is largely erased in that telling. So the question becomes, for these teachers, and for me as an outsider now to these spaces, how do you penetrate that, move beyond that common sense understanding of history that even the teacher you're talking about, I think they called it the important stuff. No one can really quite say what the important stuff is. What I can say is what the important stuff is mostly the stuff that fits within this progressive story of American uplift. And if there is a story that centers the United States as attached to a white racist project, for one, that's just one example, or a sexist project, or a homophobic project, or a xenophobic project, all of those things don't quite fit within the main thesis of US history education. And again, that doesn't come out of thin air. 100 years ago, when social studies as a discipline, as a field in education was conceived, it was conceived at a time when public education was trying to figure out how do we essentially assimilate an increasingly pluralist national society into a sense of belonging under the conditions that white people set. And that's the genesis, unfortunately, of a lot of social studies education. So US history education still sits within that concept, which means that if you want to do this work, if you want to truly confront the truth of white supremacy and racism in classrooms, you're actually doing it in a way that has to work outside of those institutional frames of social studies education. I'm not saying that you shouldn't consider what your colleagues feel. I'm not saying, you shouldn't listen to parent concerns or administration concerns. I get it. But the reality is you have to prepare for those kinds of hurdles and how you're going to negotiate them.
So Christoph, for the teachers that you worked with as part of this study, did they find concrete ways to navigate that struggle to embrace or conceive of their identities, even as actors in this power dynamic?
In many ways, they were able to do that. One of my teacher participants, he approached the US history course consistently with a class analysis that also involves race and a critique of the country's long racist project. Now, the way that he did that from one lesson to the next could vary, but he junked the textbook entirely. Like he said, I'm not using the textbook at all. When many teachers do that, as he was pulling from a grab bag of digital history sites. So for example, there's a site run out of the City University of New York called I believe it's called the American Social History Project, where he was pulling a lot of stuff from. The unfortunate thing for him, as he was gathering all of this curriculum from all these digital sites, is that he was largely doing it on his own, because it's seen by, I think, the department as a side project. And when you're talking about issues of race, class, gender, it's not, as that teacher in Rachel's example said, it's the important stuff necessarily. Now, I had another teacher who was working more within her PLC when it came to revising assessment, to revising instruction. Her approach was to bring in a lot of different primary and secondary sources with students. So she was saturating students, but she also was using the textbook. So she was using the textbook as this, okay, here's this one narrative, and then here are these other sources that we use to counter that narrative. Which in that approach, it was great that the students were getting exposure to these readings outside the textbook they wouldn't have otherwise, but the students, she and the students were then essentially working double time. So the question becomes then strategically, how do we start to carve out more space so that students can deal with the truth of white supremacy and racism? And the reality is that the conclusion that I came to, and that I'm still working through to some extent, is that you do have to start with student investigations of white supremacy and racism that are bounded by time or geography or people, that are specific in nature. Make a commitment to those, and then start to elbow and punch your way out from there and make decisions about what has to go, what has to be excluded.
No, I appreciate it, because it's really reflects my university teaching enterprise too. Teaching large lecture courses for Intro to Native American History, for example. There's a certain amount of unlearning that needs to be done, as you described. How do I guide students through matching this material to the master narrative that they have learned, especially through AP US history or whatever their exposure to social studies has been before? And then, you know, I certainly haven't solved it, finding ways to, you know, meet them where they're at, to ask them to dig a little bit deeper and then push out from what they know to something new that they don't know. I reflected the same exercise in writing a book that was really about one place where the Lumbee tribe has resided and formed its nation for the last 300 years. And that process was really about excluding. You know, it was really about a lot of what I couldn't include about Lumbee history, so that I could comment on the relationship between our community's history and US national master narratives.
Right.
And so as a scholar, there's a huge push and pull there, and then I feel it in the classroom all the time. I wonder, Rachel, when you've worked with Carolina K-12 and the oral history fellows, they're using source material that's interview based, that's specifically drawn, you know, from voices outside those master narratives. What kinds of, are you seeing similar phenomenon to what Christoph has related, or are there other?
Well, I mean, it's very similar in the sense that these are teachers who, you know, took it upon themselves to apply to this program that we were offering at UNC and to spend time in the summer with us learning, in this case, specifically about the civil rights movement, sort of new ways of thinking about the civil rights movement. Because even, you know, a lot of times the way high schools teach about the civil rights movement silences a lot of people's experiences because it focuses on the national movement. And one of the things that I always noticed with students was, you know, they would come out of it kind of thinking, well, you know, I'm no Martin Luther King, right? But when you expose them to all of the people in their own communities and little towns and places all around them that were a part of the movement, it it makes it just much more easy for them, for the students, to understand the role of regular everyday people, which then opens up more space for their own both sense of connection to that past, and I always think, you know, a sense of what's possible for them today. And I think that teachers were really excited about that. We talked about how, you know, students often think that history happened long ago and far away to people not like me. And when you listen to people's voices who sound just like you or your grandma or something, you know, it just blows that narrative out of the water. And so teachers were really excited about that, and they saw the power of using these oral histories, and they worked really hard to create lesson plans to incorporate these oral histories, which we now, you know, have up on our website, and Carolina K-12 has available. So those are available to teachers across the state or across the nation or the world, really. One of the things I was interested, Christoph, in I know that you did interviewing with these teachers as part of your research, and that I think, if I'm right, that one of the things you interviewed them about was kind of what in their own past led them to this commitment to teaching.
Yeah.
And were there commonalities there, or was it mostly really sort of unique stories? What did you end up thinking about who these teachers are and where they came from?
Naturally, all their stories were quite different and unique in all these wonderful ways. There was one commonality, which was really interesting, that came up, and particularly was quite fortunate, since this work is funded by the Center for the Study of the American South. All these teachers expressed, really unprompted by me, a commitment to the South as a region, but not in, I think when there's like this conventional sort of white image of the South. People say, in terms of cuisine and music and all these things, and this bucolic image of the South. All three teachers had a commitment to the South as a place of resistance in some way. And in all three cases, there was some origin point that involved a dislocation from the South and a return to it with fresh perspective. And all three expressed like, I understand the South as this placeholder for explicit and overt white supremacy and racism, but this is the place I want to be, and this is the place I want to do this work. Folks. The other thing I would say, and Rachel, this is something you hinted at too, is that the land and the place that these schools sit on, where they exist in their communities, those are powerful places to work from. So when I see the best work that comes out of these teachers working within the Southern Oral History program or an institute we did a few years ago, is when they return to their communities and they begin to investigate what's going on around the school. As it concerns white supremacy and racism, if you're a teacher in the state of North Carolina, your community and where your school sits has some history with white supremacy and racism in it. It is there. And so when teachers go back and they do that work on their own, they end up developing some pretty powerful lessons and stuff that matters to the students. Malidna, with your work, thinking about your work, I imagine what gets you excited is digging deep into that history. But then when you go to this Survey U.S. History course, all of a sudden you're theoretically responsible for all of this. But all of this, all that breadth, all that survey, at some point it becomes this futile task because you're never going to get to everything. Yet we make teachers responsible for all this. I personally think that there is power in digging in deep into a history and then working out from there to say something about the United States overall, rather than beginning with a grand triumphalist thesis of the United States and then hopscotching around to various communities.
So Christoph, can you just talk a little bit about what you hope to accomplish next as you move on from UNC? What do you see your role as being, and how you see this sort of bridge between the academy and the classroom?
Well, I'm really lucky in that the position I've gotten that I will be moving into as an assistant professor of education at Meredith College is primarily in teacher education. I look forward to digging into the history of white supremacy and racism in the United States through in-depth investigations of this stuff with teachers, based on scholarship, based on what's going on in the community around us, in a way that's more purposeful. Now, Malidna, you had asked a question about my position, which is something that's really important to consider in my research. I come to this work as a white male, as an outsider in many cases to the direct experiences with white supremacy and racism, and what it feels like to directly face those oppressions. One issue is that when I often tell folks that I'm doing research around white supremacy and racism, I don't think it's necessarily the problem, but it's often presented as timely. or, something that attends to this particular moment, that a research direction that is just attentive to the overt white nationalism that we see around us today. And the other thing that happens is that if I'm researching about white supremacy and racism, and this is where the challenge for scholars of color comes in, because I don't face the extra burden that they do, is that it gets siloed into this race discourse as this side current. And in US history education, that's a problem. One of the reasons I'm focusing on white supremacy and racism is because I believe it can be a core analytical frame for how students and classes approach the history of the United States. White educators and white teachers need to confront white supremacy and racism in the classroom. That is for sure. One problem or potential issue is centering the feelings and intellectual processes of white educators and white teachers when this knowledge is readily available among Black, Latinx, Indigenous, Asian, anyone who is not white, who has experienced on some level and has to, as a matter of survival, navigate systems of white supremacy and racism, has this knowledge themselves in their community, in their family, but for whatever reason, in a predominantly white teaching force in North Carolina and around the United States, that knowledge is increasingly not counted as valuable for some reason.
I'd love to ask you to comment on a couple of specific examples that folks have asked us to address in our session. Things that I think are left out of the main narrative of the history of education in the United States, but perhaps which reveals some of the systemic forces that you've just described. One audience member asked us to comment on school systems for minorities that aren't African American in North Carolina. Their mother was sent to a school for American Indians before integration in Robeson County, North Carolina. And she had said that Lumbees, members of the Lumbee tribe, weren't allowed to attend a Black school or a white school. And this audience member would love to just hear more about that kind of system. Relatedly, we have the story of Polly Murray, which is so prominent in North Carolina history and at UNC. And how did Polly overcome the sexism of Harvard and the racism of UNC, as well as the anti-LGBT stance of the Episcopal Church? Her life, of course, is a testament to intersectionality and how different systems of oppression converge. And I'm wondering about the relationship between, Polly's quest for education and influence and the way she managed to navigate those systems as a person of color and an LGBT person. And a woman, and then Native Americans, Indigenous people as a group, how they have been kind of also forced to navigate systems of segregation and Jim Crow. Do you have thoughts on the relationships there?
Yeah, I think both. To start with Polly Murray, just to start with the second one, as a Black LGBT woman, Polly Murray has 3 strikes against her when it comes to being included in conventional US history curriculum. And the reality is that if you follow Polly Murray's life, you can trace her life across several eras of activism in the 20th century. So you're talking about an activist, a religious figure, a scholar, who shows up in, the fight for integration before Brown versus Board of Education. She actually shows up even before that as a friend of Langston Hughes. She shows up later as one of the founding members of the National Organization for Women. Yet in each of these places, she's erased. Because what master narrative and common sense frames tend to do is they tend to attach an issue or an event or a theme to one community of people or one person. And if that figure or that community doesn't get attached to that thesis or that story, then they get erased. And we see this same thing with the Lumbies, right? And the reality is, because in the master narrative of US history, the story of segregation gets told as a black-white story, which means that in this case, the Lumbee experience is something that's going to get sidelined. Just to give you an example, I am going to share my screen for a second here. What textbooks do is they take entire communities, national communities, and they shoehorn them into one place. So, and then the way they frame them. So for example, if you take this chapter on migration here, you have the theoretical appearance of Native Americans in the history here. But you see how it's framed. Cultures clash on the prairie, as if for some reason Native Americans are responsible for the theft of their own land, and the violence and white settler violence on their land. But the thing that you can't see here is this is really the last time even an indirect reference to Native Americans appears in this textbook going forward. And so it's natural that that story would get minimized and erased. But I'm curious for you, Malidna, what your sense is of to what extent have you been exposed to in schools, in your own schooling, and have others been exposed to the story of Lumbee education in North Carolina?
Well, I would say that similar to you, I brought personal family experiences and exposure to my knowledge of US history from a very early point in my life. And I gradually then began to question why these stories are not part of the standard US history narrative. I mean, not only because they're important to my family, but because they're important to the state of North Carolina, or, they were deserving enough of inclusion in chapter 13 here, at least to be able to, to say that, well, Native Americans matter at some point in US history. Why are they not, more thoroughly interwoven into the national story? And it was much later when I began writing my first book, which is about Lumbees in the Jim Crow South, and deals quite heavily with education and three-way segregated schools. It became extremely obvious to me why Native people had been left out, in particular of Southern stories of segregation, but also national stories of the development of white supremacy. And there's not just one reason, there's many reasons, but I think in the case of what we're dealing with here in this region, the extent of theft of native land by European settlers is simply unacknowledged.
Right.
And so going back to Jamestown or some of our kind of origin stories of the US or of the South, the overwhelming narrative is that Native Americans just receded because of a culture clash or because of some, biological or technological insufficiency. And as such, people spend their entire lives believing, therefore, that Native people don't exist in the South today.
Right.
Even though North Carolina has the largest population of Native people east of the Mississippi, it's simply not believed that Natives had a significant engagement with a rather recent phenomenon like Jim Crow segregation. So that problem of long ago and far away that concerns all history teachers and motivates us to bring our students into an awareness of why history matters has a kind of doubly negative impact on the ways in which Native people are excluded from that history. We're just that master narrative which insists upon the fundamental rightness of European settlement in this continent depends upon the continued exclusion and erasure of Native people as ongoing forces of historical change. So that sort of baseline or that sort of basic paradigm of understanding of US history means that it's almost impossible for people to conceptualize from the get-go that Native people had some important revealing engagement with something like Jim Crow segregation in the 20th century. And then fortunately, with the research methods and the sort of conversations that I was trying to speak to with that first book, people began to understand it immediately because of the paradox that you pointed out about progressive America, right? Not so progressive. It was at that same moment that white supremacy was consistently, intentionally structured as a political force to exclude or to shape democracy, And so when we remember that Jim Crow was created at that same time and was naturalized in a distorted way at that same time, at the same time also as these Indian wars referenced in the Sitting Bull chapter occurred, we can no longer see these things as really unconnected. And so I was very gratified to see that when we dug into this experience of Native American segregated schooling in Robeson County, that all these issues of how white supremacy manifests itself nationally were able to pop up and explicitly sort of counter this progressive narrative.
Yeah, I was looking at the 8th grade standards for North Carolina. Number one, there's a standard that talks about the decline of American Indians, so that's how they're presented, as erased or sort of disappeared, and that's how they're put in.
Well, what I would love to have the opportunity to do more frequently is to sit in dialogue with those teachers,
right,
so that we can exchange ideas and talk about where their students are coming from. It helps me better prepare for my college classrooms, right, to know what standards, how they get enacted in pre-college environments. But then also I think that the themes that you can't really pull out from a static work of scholarship can be more helpful to teachers in dialogue. So us being able to pose questions to one another about how to address some of these paradoxes or intractable ways in which standards shape knowledge I would just love the opportunity to be able to do that in more real time.
Yeah, and if there's, and for the district, for the administrators, for the district curriculum supervisors, for all these folks working at that institutional level, particularly if any of them are listening to this, that is, teachers have significant exposure to professional development within their buildings. For whatever reason, and I'm hearing this from teachers, and I'm seeing it, they are not getting enough of what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Even people who really have been erased can in fact be rediscovered and brought back into the narrative in powerful new ways. And so I'm just really thrilled that you're participating in that big project and helping teachers learn how to do that themselves, whether it's figures in their own school neighborhoods, or figures that are important to that community.
And U.S. history teachers are active producers of history, not just translators, not just consumers, but producers of history. And with that role, it means that they are participants in a power struggle in terms of whose story gets told and how it gets told. And if U.S. history teachers choose to confront the truth of white supremacy and racism in this country, they participate in that power struggle. And I encourage them to do that.
Christoph, we hope your work will be a resource for public school educators and will inspire scholars here at UNC and other universities to collaborate with local schools. Although your dissertation is complete, congratulations again. I know you'll continue to work on these important issues and prompt hard conversations which move our region, our home region, forward. Thank you for the difference that you're making in classrooms and especially in teacher education. We're very grateful to you and of course to Rachel from the Southern Oral History Program for participating in this discussion. And our conversation today will be made available to educators through Carolina K-12 and at south.unc.edu. We'll have some other references to the works described, digital resources for history teachers to take advantage of. South.unc.edu is where you'll find out more information about the McColl Dissertation Fellowship, which is available for graduate students in their final year of dissertation writing. Christoph, we just could not be more pleased and honored that you chose to accept this award last year and that it has taken you to this point. So thank you so much on behalf of all of us at the center. For those of you watching, thank you for your interest. Thank you for teaching a more complete history of the United States and the South.
Thank you.
Thank you.